Imagine a vast desert, sand swirling in the wind, tanks moving in the shimmering heat. It's early 1941 and the world is locked in the throes of war. Among the Axis ranks, a division is about to carve its legend into history, the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete. Formed in 1939 as Italy's 2nd Armoured Division, Ariete, meaning battering ram, would become both feared and respected on the unforgiving battlefields of North Africa. From the siege lines at Tobruk to the decisive struggle at El Alamein, Ariete's tanks and its elite bersaglieri infantry stood as symbols of determination and sacrifice. A force so notable that even adversaries and allies alike remarked on their courage. But who were these men behind the ram's head insignia? What drove them to hold, attack, and ultimately make their last stand amid the sand and chaos? Today we explore the history and fate of the division that Rommel himself mourned as our oldest Italian comrades. The story of the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete, forged by iron will and lost in a sea of flame and steel. In the anxious summer of 1937, as Europe edged towards war, Italy looked to steel and speed for its future. In Milan, the Italian Regio Esercito formed its spearhead, the 2nd Armoured Brigade, initially consisting of the 3rd Bersaglieri Regiment, later replaced by the 8th Bersaglieri Regiment. On the 1st of February 1939, the brigade was raised to divisional level, destined for glory under a new name, Ariete, the Ram. Soon the 32nd Tank Infantry Regiment rumbled into formation, followed by the thunder of the 132nd Armoured Artillery Regiment. These, along with the engineers, signals and support troops, made up the Ariete, Italy's best hope for modern armoured warfare. Its ranks swelled with volunteers, its motto, Feria mole, ferio cuore, iron mass, iron heart. When war erupted in the west, the Ariete was mobilised and rushed to the French border, but Italy's armoured vanguard would not see action. During the brief Battle of France, Ariete was kept in reserve, its might untested, tanks waiting behind the lines for a battle that never came. Their true challenge lay across the sea. In December 1940, as the North African sands became Italy's new front, Ariete's main units, the 8th Bersaglieri, 32nd Tank Regiment and 132nd Artillery, left Italy for Libya's burning deserts. Soon they would face fierce trial, forging their reputation in the crucible of desert war. The legend of Ariete had begun, from Milan to the Mediterranean and the shifting sands of Libya. Italy's armoured fist would soon be tested to its limit and beyond. While the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete had still been preparing in Italy in late 1940, British and Commonwealth troops unleashed Operation Compass. Sweeping through Cyrenaica, the Italian front collapsed alarmingly fast. It was at Baie de Fom that disaster struck. The British raced across the desert, gutting the retreat. Days of desperate Italian attacks failed to break the roadblock. 25,000 Italian prisoners, 107 tanks and 93 guns fell into British hands. Ariete had been hurried to Libya. Its mission, restore Italian armoured pride and hold the line for Mussolini's shattered forces. But the division itself was transforming. Gone were most of its old undergunned M1139 tanks, lost during Operation Compass. Tank Battalions 1 and 2 of the Ariete that used the tanks transferred to the 4th Tank Infantry Regiment, which was destroyed. Ariete received the M1340s, Italy's new medium tank, better armed and armoured, and better suited, although still with its own reliability issues, for the open desert. The Ariete's Tank Battalion 5 was transferred and assigned to a special armoured brigade, whilst the Ariete was stationed in Libya. Some of the M13 tanks used by the battalion were lost during Operation Compass, and remaining tanks and the whole battalion were destroyed at Baie de Fom. The Italians also had self-propelled guns, notably the autocannoni de 117 mounted on the trailer beds of Lancia 3-row trucks, a powerful addition to the Ariete. These trucks provided key support to the Italian medium tanks that lacked firepower. Artillery was boosted with 75mm and 105mm field guns. There was also an anti-aircraft variant of the Lancia 3-row with the Autocannoni da 2065. With the arrival of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps, ordered by Hitler himself after the defeats during Operation Compass and the aftermath, the war in North Africa changed. Ariete was assigned to the German-Italian Mobile Corps, the beginnings of the legendary alliance that would stalk the deserts from Tobruk to El Alamein. The alliance began in March 1941. Rommel took leadership of several Italian divisions, including armoured and motorised infantry divisions. In total, he had at his disposal around 100,000 Italian soldiers, 7,000 Italian trucks, 1,000 Italian guns, and 151 Italian aircraft. Ariete's structure changed too. The original 32nd Tank Infantry Regiment, battered and depleted, was steadily replaced by the 132nd Tank Infantry Regiment, formed on September 1st, 1941. Fielding battalions equipped with the M1340. By late 1941, battalions like the 9 and later 10 and 13 formed the division's backbone. Ariete would soon be tested, as Axis forces counterattacked in Cyrenaica, besieged Tobruk, failing to capture the port city, and bled against the 8th Army. Over the coming campaigns, Bir El Gubi, Gazala, the Hell of El Alamein, the division's new tanks and reorganised units would distinguish themselves, fighting with gallantry despite technical and numerical inferiority. In late November 1941, as Operation Crusader raged across the Western Desert, the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete prepared to meet the British counterattack. The British 8th Army hoped to outflank and destroy Ariete with superior numbers and speed, but the Italians, dug in and well supported by anti-tank guns, counterattacked ferociously. Ariete's stand at Bir El Gubi on 19th November blunted the main British assault. Ariete forced the British 22nd Armoured Brigade back, destroying numerous Crusader and Stuart tanks. For the first time, Italian armoured units stood their ground and counterpunched with deadly effect. The Ariete, armed with its M1340 tanks and the support of the Bersaglieri and artillery, managed to destroy 50 to 82 tanks whilst receiving 34 losses. Ariete's resolve marked a turning point for Italian armoured reputation in North Africa. Though the larger battle continued to ebb and flow, at Bir El Gubi, the Iron Rams proved their worth, forcing British tanks back and keeping the Axis southern flank intact during a pivotal moment of Operation Crusader. At the Battle of Gazala, the Ariete once again fought with distinction. In the early hours of May 27, 1942, under the vast desert sky near Bir Hakeim, the Battle of Gazala entered a decisive phase. The objective was to take a fortification. The Ariete, driven on by its successors, launched an attack, but were met with strong resistance, a determined Free French brigade. The first attack was ill-fated, and the Italians received heavy losses. But Field Marshal Rommel devised a plan. With Rommel's strike force manoeuvring south of the main Allied defences, 2 Italian divisions, Trieste, a motorised division, and Ariete, formed a pincer movement. The Trieste attacking from the west, while the Ariete was positioned on the left flank and attempting to attack from the rear. Their objective: shatter any Allied resistance guarding the southern approach. As dawn broke, the Ariete Division advanced rapidly, encountering the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, positioned southeast of Bir Hakeim. With overwhelming force, Ariete's tanks and armour pressed the attack. Sand and smoke filled the air as the Italian assault scattered the defenders. Within a short, brutal engagement, the brigade was overrun. Hundreds captured, positions abandoned, and equipment lost. The swift destruction of the Indian Motor Brigade opened the door for Axis forces to strike deeper into Allied lines. The Ariete Division, emboldened by its success, pushed onward to threaten Bir Hakeim. The battle's momentum now favoured the Axis, and deserts once still and silent bore wounded men, shattered vehicles, and the rising clamour of advancing tanks. The fate of the Gazala line and the North African campaign was in the balance. In the relentless heat of the North African desert in 1942, the fate of Tobruk, an Allied stronghold perched on the Libyan coast, hung in the balance. Field Marshal Rommel knew that to seize the port, he needed every Axis division to fight as one, German and Italian side by side. Among Rommel's key units was the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete. In the months leading to Tobruk's eventual fall in June 1942, Ariete's continuous pressure and resilience against repeated Allied counterblows were essential to Axis strategy. As Rommel launched Operation Venezia, he positioned forces around Bir Hakeim, a southern part of the Gazala line. From here, the Italians and Germans pushed the British back and forced their way to Tobruk. The Ariete Division fought with distinction, helping breach British defences and cut off Allied withdrawals, contributing decisively to the city's final encirclement and surrender. The supplies captured at Tobruk, food, fuel, vehicles, would propel Rommel toward his next dramatic thrust into Egypt. In the harsh crucible of Tobruk, the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete proved itself not merely as an Italian contingent, but as a critical partner in Rommel's campaign. A powerful hammer that, time and again, struck at the heart of the Allied defences, laying the groundwork for one of the Axis' most dramatic victories in the Western Desert. The North African campaign demonstrated that the Ariete could be relied upon to fight alone as a unit. One of Rommel's intelligence officers, Major Freiherr von Mellenthin, described an assault carried out by Italian soldiers. They dived on the perimeter in one of the most spectacular attacks I have ever seen. A great cloud of dust and smoke rose from the sector under attack while our bombs crashed into the defences. The entire German and Italian artillery joined in with a tremendous and well-coordinated fire. Rommel, now acting under the Italian Supreme Command structure known as Delisa, based at Tobruk, advanced into Egypt, steadily approaching a coastal town known as El Alamein. The Axis faced resistance as it approached the town. It would be at El Alamein that the Ariete Division would meet its fate. The British already occupied the Suez Canal. The 8th Army was positioned here, very close to the ports and cities of Egypt. It was important for the British that the Axis did not get this far. Retreating British units from Gazala were reorganised and ordered to use delaying tactics at El Alamein to halt the advance of the German forces led by Rommel. On the 2nd of September 1942, the Ariete, along with another armoured division, Littorio, was ordered to attack Alam el Halfa Ridge to the south of El Alamein. But this proved difficult due to minefields placed everywhere and bomber attacks taking place at night. Further positions were attacked by the Germans and Italians, but each time the British forced them back. The Axis withdrew. Rommel's forces were experiencing fuel shortages. The battle was considered a stalemate. On the 23rd of October 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein took place. The battle lasted until the 11th of November 1942. During the battle, Rommel had a large force at his disposal. Not only his Afrika Korps and Panzer units, but Italian Infantry Corps, Italian Motorised Corps, and 8 Italian divisions, supported by the Italian 5th Squadra Regia Aeronautica. However, the Axis suffered a barrage of fire from over 800 heavy guns aimed right at them. Many Italian units demonstrated immense courage and bravery in the face of adversity, not least the Ariete. Not only did they have to face heavy guns, but British heavy tanks heading straight for them, and British air superiority above. Before the battle started, the Ariete had approximately 100 M1441 tanks and 16 Semavente de 75-18 self-propelled guns. Both vehicles were transferred and entered into service with battalions of the Ariete Division earlier in the year. The tanks were outdated, and there was simply not enough of the 75-18 self-propelled guns. Supporting the tanks and Bersaglieri were improved artillery battalions of 88mm German flak guns for anti-aircraft and anti-tank purpose, as well as the Cannoni de 9053. Some artillery battalions of the 132nd Armoured Artillery Regiment were still using the 4732 field gun that had the capability to penetrate the armour of heavy infantry tanks like the Matilda. What the Ariete and Panzer divisions faced at El Alamein was catastrophic. This quote from Rommel's diary, which was published as Rommel's Papers, goes as follows. Relays of British bombers continued their attack throughout the night of the 26th. At about 02 hours, a furious British barrage by guns of every calibre suddenly began in the northern sector. Soon it was impossible to distinguish between gunfire and exploding shells, and the sky grew bright with the glare of muzzle flashes and shell bursts. Continuous bombing attacks seriously delayed the approach march of the 21st Panzer Division and a third of the Ariete. By dawn, the 90th Light Division and the Trieste had taken up position around the southern side of Sidi Abed el-Rahman. Here is another quote from Rommel's diary around about a week later during the battle, November the 2nd. This is Rommel writing about two of the other Italian divisions. The British were shooting up one after the other of the Littorio's and Trieste's tanks. The Italian 47mm anti-tank gun was no more effective against the British tanks than our own 50mm, and signs of disintegration were beginning to show among the Italian troops. Units of the Littorio and the Trieste were on the run to the west and were no longer in the hands of their officers. It was shortly after this that the Ariete was repositioned and still taking orders. At this point the Ariete was still organised as a fighting unit, but air attacks still kept coming. The Afrika Korps was decimated with only about 35 serviceable tanks left. The Ariete dug in and fought with immense courage, but it was too much. Here is another quote from Rommel about a signal he received from the Italian commander of the Ariete. This was the last signal before the Ariete Division was obliterated. Presumably it is sent by the commander of the Ariete at the time, Francesco Antonio Arena. The last signal came from the Ariete at about 15:30 hours. Enemy tanks penetrated south of Ariete. Ariete now encircled. Location 5 kilometers northwest Bir El Abed. Ariete's tanks in action. All of the Italian tanks of the Ariete were destroyed at El Alamein. The division disbanded. Remnants of the Ariete retreated and fell back. Astonishingly, remaining personnel from 3 Italian divisions, the Ariete, Littorio and Trieste, regrouped to form the Cantalupi group. Any remaining tanks, vehicles and men were put to use. The group was led by Colonel Gaetano Cantalupi. In the aftermath of the events at El Alamein, Hitler and Mussolini agreed that the Axis forces must hold a city called El Aguila. Rommel had already defied orders to stand to the last at El Alamein. Tobruk had gone, and the British had seized control of the port city. The Axis forces were withdrawing to Tunisia. The British launched a huge offensive to try and cut off the retreat led by the 7th Armoured Division. Axis units were retreating quickly using roads along the coast rather than the harsh terrains of the desert. The Cantalupi group was one of them. Rommel feared that a nearby New Zealand Armoured Division would intercept the Axis forces. An attack did come, but it was the 7th Armoured Division fighting the Cantalupi group near El Aguila. The group formed an amazing rearguard action to repel the attack, the British launching everything at them. Rommel wrote in his diary, Late in the morning, a superior enemy force launched an attack on Tactical Group Ariete, which was located southwest of El Aguila, with its right flank resting on the Sebcha Chabira and its left linking up with 90th Light Division. Bitter fighting ensued against 80 British tanks and lasted for nearly 10 hours. The Italians put up a magnificent fight for which they deserved the utmost credit. Finally, in the evening, the British were thrown back by a counter-attack of the Centauros armoured regiment, leaving 22 tanks and 2 armoured cars burnt out or damaged on the battlefield. The British intention of cutting off the 90th Light Division had been foiled. This band of grizzled, battle-weary Italians fought on until May 1943, fighting alongside the Italian 131st Armoured Division Centauro, where they finally surrendered in Tunisia. I want to conclude this video with analysis of the 132nd Armoured Division Ariete. How was it that this fighting unit were able to use inferior equipment, tanks and vehicles, and still somehow make them work, achieving notable victories until El Alamein, that was to be a battle too far, and receive praise and admiration from those who fought alongside the Ariete and fought against it? I think the first factor is to analyse the command of the division. Leadership is key to maintaining high morale and discipline. For those Italian tank crews and soldiers, it was even more important. The odds were against them often when entering the battle. They were outgunned and using tanks that were technically inferior to contemporary Allied armour. The 132nd Armoured Division benefited from experienced leadership, disciplined organisation and a working environment that boosted morale. I will cite one commander of the Ariete that demonstrated this strong leadership. Interestingly, the command of the Ariete changed quite often throughout the North African campaign. There are at least 6 different commanding officers, but I will talk about only one of them because of the key events during his command. That commanding officer is Mario Bellotta. Bellotta had a wealth of military experience, having fought as an officer during the First World War. He was already battle-hardened. During the interwar period, he commanded artillery regiments and participated in the invasion of Albania, preceding World War II in 1939. He took command of the Ariete Division in July 1941. The division by this time had been sent to the Western Desert to fight alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps. Bellotta led the Ariete to notable victories during the battles of Bir el Gubi in late 1941, thus enhancing the Ariete's reputation within the Axis forces. He oversaw a key period for the division as it cut its teeth in the deserts of North Africa. He demonstrated tactical nous that achieved early victories for the Ariete, notably defeating British regiments of Crusader tanks. He left the command of the division in January 1942. He was promoted shortly after to Major General and was given command of the artillery of the Italian army on the Eastern Front. There were times during the North African campaign where fighting and battles didn't go so well and the division took heavy losses, but despite this, the men fighting in the division seemed to build a fierce determination as if they were used to it. They knew they were up against it, the crews knew their tanks were inferior and they were facing death. But it inspired them to dig in. Even when losing their friends and comrades, it helped them to become an effective unit that could dig in and hold key positions, providing cover for German panzer units retreating or repositioning on the battlefield. They could be relied upon, and when needed, could counter-attack and trade blows with the Allied forces. A strong camaraderie was built under Bellotta's command, and this continued under the subsequent commanding officers of the division. We should also consider the leadership of Colonel Gaetano Cantalupi, leading the Cantalupi group after the demise of the Ariete Division. He took charge and reorganised remnants of the Ariete, along with what was left of 2 other Italian divisions. The tactical group demonstrated immense courage and determination to stand their ground against an advancing British armoured division, hell-bent on crushing the retreating Axis units. The group had severely depleted equipment, personnel and a lack of tanks. The men had just been through hell, and you would think that morale would be completely broken. To have not only held their ground but actually pushed the British back, which resulted in a failed attempt to cut off the Axis retreat, well, that not only takes guts, it also takes organisation and strategic thinking. There's a lack of information about the Cantilupe group, and I would love to learn more about how they managed to do it. I'm having to make some assumptions in this presentation. It will most likely require the reading of first-hand accounts, if there are any, that survive today. So we've covered strong leadership as a key to building an efficient, organised, well-drilled fighting unit. Military tactics and strategic deployment is another factor that we must look at. This was shaped by Italian armoured doctrine, which had changed throughout the 1930s in the build-up to the Second World War. Around late 1920s to early 1930s, there were some Italian military leaders and general staff that were in favour of the infantry and not keen on the idea of armour and motorisation. But it started to change, particularly after the events of the Spanish Civil War. There was a key change to the Italian Army's armoured doctrine in 1938, the Guerra di Rapido Corso, which translates to War of Rapid Course. This emphasised mobile warfare, but also the need for combined arms. The doctrine emphasises the tanks should be used to spearhead attacks and breakthroughs, and use speed to exploit the gaps and have infantry and artillery in support. This is demonstrated under Mario Bellotta's command with the early victories for the Ariete in North Africa. I've managed to find some information about the battles at Bir el Gubi, where the Ariete managed to repel the British counter-offensive under Operation Crusader, so this was around late 1941. I have a little insight into the strategy that Bellotta would implement on the battlefield. This example demonstrates how combined arms was critical when encountering enemy armoured vehicles. It is difficult to interpret things from written descriptions, but I will do my best. I've used graphics from the game War Thunder for visual presentation. This is scaled down, obviously you would have lots more tanks, infantry and artillery. Bellotta would deploy a couple of platoons of Italian medium tanks ahead to meet the enemy armour. These tanks would be M1340s at this time. But not all available tank units would be sent to the front. He would have a large number of M1340 tanks waiting in reserve. He would position the infantry and artillery close to each other and not too far from the M1340 tanks, but from another angle of attack. For example, it could be on one of the flanks. And they would be dug in, entrenched and in good defensive positions. The infantry was comprised of the Bersaglieri battalions with light infantry, machine gun platoons and Cannoni de 4732 field guns. The artillery regiments were comprised of field guns including the Cannoni de 7527, which was a 75mm field gun, possibly a 105mm field gun, the Cannoni de 10528, and most likely by then the Lancia 3-row trucks with 117 SPG guns. The division did not have any Semavente 7518s at this point. They arrived a few months later in early 1942. Light tanks were also positioned with these units for protection. The Ariete did receive L640 light tanks, although only one battalion. The M1340s held in reserve could either be ordered to support the infantry and artillery positions to repel incoming attacks, or to push remaining platoons into action against oncoming Allied armour divisions. Remember, the M1340s and later M1441s were intended as an all-purpose tank. Bellotta would not send them all in at once. He would feed platoons in to meet enemy armoured vehicles. He wanted to keep the enemy tanks engaged long enough while his artillery could pound the enemy with heavy fire, but trying to minimise the losses of medium tanks. I am making some assumptions here, but I think this would be the common tactics used when facing Allied armoured vehicles. Of course, other fighting and battles may require alternative tactics under different circumstances, requiring more offensive manoeuvres, particularly when counterattacking against the Allies and facing units with less armour. The destruction of the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade at Bir Hakeim highlights a more aggressive movement rather than sitting and holding a position. For aggressive attacks, the Italian M1340s would push through with the aim to break through enemy lines. The Bersaglieri's job would be to exploit the gaps, hold positions, knock out enemy anti-tank defences and target isolated resistance. The Bersaglieri provided the mobility for the Ariete. They had motorcyclists providing speed to exploit gaps in enemy lines. The Bersaglieri also consisted of motorised infantry that could be moved to locations quickly, usually by truck. I should point out that the Bersaglieri were crack troops. This is an infantry corps of the Regio Esercito. The Bersaglieri has a long tradition dating back to the 1800s. Unlike the tank crews of the armoured divisions, they would have received rigorous training, including marksmanship instruction, forming an organised, disciplined infantry unit ready for combat even before their deployment in Libya. Artillery could also provide barrage support. This would be key to taking fortifications and well-defended entrenchments. Communication was not the best during Ballotta's time in command because many of the M1340 tanks were not fitted with radios. I don't know why, because the radios were not expensive or difficult to install back at the Ansaldo factories in Italy. However, the Italian tactics were for all units, tanks, infantry and artillery, to fight in close proximity, which would help cohesion and organisation. Tank commanders tended to use flags for signalling instructions and manoeuvres. Command tanks had radios fitted, and some of the M13 tanks in the platoons would have a radio fitted, which would help. Another issue, which was a problem for many smaller or earlier tanks in World War II with smaller crews, is that the commander of the M1340 was also the gunner. This distracts the commander from effectively communicating with his crew and observing battlefield movements, therefore hampering coordination. It would be the same problem for the M1441 tanks later. Later on in the campaign, during 1942, the armoured division's effectiveness increased. The 132nd Tank Regiment received the M1441 tanks, which were a slight improvement on the M1340s. And in early 1942, the Semovente de 7518 self-propelled guns arrived, providing excellent firepower to the division, although only a small number were received. The medium tanks and the Semoventes had to fight in coordinated attacks. By now, the medium tanks were severely lacking in firepower, relying on the self-propelled guns and artillery to knock out Allied tanks. Battles where heavy Allied armour was present usually meant that field guns had to be pushed further forward for direct fire on the enemy tanks. The tactics didn't change too much for the medium tanks. They were still used for initial engagement with the enemy armour, but they had Semoventes in close proximity to provide heavier direct fire. The Semovente provided extra versatility to the unit. The Semovente could be fired at medium ranges to target strong points and fortifications and dug-in infantry positions, but it could also use its effective effetto pronto shell, a heat shell that had the explosive firepower to penetrate strong Allied armour, and therefore could act in the role of a tank destroyer as well as artillery. The Italian medium tanks also received the effetto pronto shell late on in the North African campaign. This is something I've only found out while studying about the Ariete Division, while reading an article about a heroic tank commander of the Ariete, Luigi Pascucci. I'll save his story for another time. The effetto pronto shell would have boosted the firepower of the 47mm gun, although I don't think it would have made a huge difference because the 47mm was outdated. Communication would have improved as M1441s were fitted with radios, as were the Semoventes, further improving cohesion between the platoons of M1441s and small groups of self-propelled guns. However, despite these improvements, Ariete's effectiveness was limited by poor armour and firepower compared to late war Allied tanks and artillery, and many actions still suffered from inconsistent coordination and communication, especially under air attack. The British at El Alamein had air superiority. Air attacks can cause chaos and therefore break up organisation. Logistics also played a part in hampering the division, such as fuel shortages and lack of spare parts to carry out repairs, but this was the same for the Germans as well. As the war progressed, it became apparent that the tactics of the Ariete relied heavily on the strong divisional artillery. The armoured division has a credible armoured performance during the North African campaign, despite the superiority of Allied armour and weaponry. The 132nd Armoured Division Ariete was destroyed at El Alamein. In 1943, to commemorate the Ariete, the 135th Armoured Cavalry Division Ariete II was formed. The headquarters was based in Ferrara. The division included regiments consisting of battalions of M1542 tanks, L640 tanks, AB41 cars, various Semavente variants including the 105-25 Passotto, and various artillery guns. After the 1943 armistice, the 135th Armoured Cavalry Division fought for several days against the Germans before surrendering. The division was disbanded on the 12th of September 1943, just 4 days after the armistice came into effect. In 1948, the Ariete was reconstituted. Italy was part of a military aid programme, receiving military supplies, including Shermans, from the United States. During this period, the Regio Esercito reorganised its divisions. The 132nd Armoured Brigade was formed, later becoming a division in 1952. The Ariete is still in operation to this day. It consists of several tank regiments operating the Ariete main battle tanks, a cavalry regiment operating Centauro tank destroyers, a Bersaglieri regiment operating Dardo infantry fighting vehicles, and an artillery regiment operating the German self-propelled howitzer Panzerhaubitze 2000. Italian armour has come a long way since the Second World War, and the legend of the Ariete lives on.